From a law that accidentally created the mafia, to a presidential order that threw 120,000 innocent citizens into prison, to a decision that nearly bankrupted an entire nation in an attempt to keep the peace. This is the story of the dumbest, most catastrophic, and most insane laws ever signed by US presidents. Spoiler alert, some of them were based on good intentions but led to total disaster, while others were simply acts of pure tyranny. Let's start at the very beginning, with a president who decided that freedom of speech wasn't such a great idea after all. Just a few years after America fought and won its freedom, the second president, John Adams, found himself in an extremely difficult position. The country was young, fragile, and it seemed like a war with the powerful nation of France was about to break out. The country wasn't united at home either. Newspapers that supported his political opponent, Thomas Jefferson, relentlessly criticized Adams, calling him a tyrant, a monarchist, and even mocking his weight. Paranoia gripped the government. Adams and his Federalist allies were convinced that French spies and radical immigrants were hiding in every dark corner, preparing to destroy the young republic from within. Frightened and angry, Adams decided to act. In 1798, he signed a series of laws that would go down in history as the Alien and Sedition Acts, and it was one of the most shameful attacks on American freedoms in history. The Alien Acts gave the president the power to deport any non-citizen he deemed, quote, zero quote, without a trial or any due process, just with the snap of his fingers. Imagine this. You're an immigrant who came to America seeking freedom, but if the president doesn't like the way you look or what you say, you can simply be thrown out of the country. But the most outrageous part was the Sedition Act. This law made it a crime to publish _quote_1_ writings against the government, Congress, or the president. In essence, it outlawed criticism of the government. This was a direct assault on the First Amendment of the Constitution, which guarantees freedom of speech in the press. The Adams administration began a witch hunt. More than 20 newspaper editors and politicians who supported Jefferson were arrested. One congressman, Matthew Lyon, was thrown in jail for 4 months for suggesting in an article that Adams had an _quote_2_. Another man was arrested for drunkenly criticizing the president. America, a country born from a revolution against tyranny, began jailing its own citizens for their words. But Adams had made a colossal blunder. Instead of silencing his critics, he turned them into martyrs. Public anger boiled over. People saw these laws for what they were, a desperate attempt by one political party to cling to power by suppressing dissent. The law that was meant to crush the opposition instead made it stronger. In the presidential election of 1800, these acts became a central issue. Thomas Jefferson used them as proof that the Federalists were turning into monarchists. In a twist of fate, the law designed to ensure John Adams's re-election became one of the main reasons for his crushing defeat. It was a perfect example of how fear and a lust for power can lead a smart man to make an incredibly dumb decision. You would think his successor, Thomas Jefferson himself, the author of the Declaration of Independence and a champion of liberty, would have learned a lesson about the dangers of government overreach. But as history shows, even geniuses are capable of epic failures. The next law on our list belongs to him, and it nearly destroyed the American economy. By 1807, Jefferson faced the same problem as Adams. Europe was at war again. Napoleonic France and Great Britain were fighting for dominance on the seas, and American merchant ships were caught between the hammer and the anvil. The British Navy constantly stopped American vessels, forcing American sailors into service in the Royal Navy, claiming they were actually British deserters. This was humiliating and violated U.S. sovereignty. Jefferson desperately wanted to avoid war. He believed in the power of what he called peaceful coercion. His logic was simple. Europe depends on American goods: cotton, grain, tobacco. What if America just stopped trading with everyone? He thought the economic pain would force Britain and France to respect U.S. rights. It seemed like an elegant, bloodless solution. Thus, the Embargo Act of 1807 was born. This law banned all American ships from leaving U.S. ports for any foreign country, a complete shutdown of maritime trade. On paper, it looked like a powerful economic weapon. In reality, it was like shooting yourself in both feet to scare the enemy. Jefferson had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He vastly overestimated Europe's dependence on American goods, and tragically underestimated America's dependence on foreign trade. The consequences were immediate and devastating. The American economy collapsed. Exports dropped by a shocking 80% in just 1 year. Port cities like New York and Boston became ghost towns. Ships rotted at the docks, sailors were jobless, farmers couldn't sell their crops, and merchants went bankrupt. Instead of uniting the country, the embargo fractured it. In New England, where the economy was entirely dependent on shipping, smuggling became rampant. People openly defied the law, moving goods into Canada. Jefferson's government had to enact increasingly harsh and tyrannical measures to enforce its peaceful law, making it even more hated. The Embargo Act was a total failure. It had almost no effect on Britain and France, but it plunged America into a deep economic depression. The public backlash was so severe that the act was repealed in the final days of Jefferson's presidency. It was a humiliating end for a great idealist who proved that even the noblest intentions can lead to the dumbest results. But if an economic disaster born of naivety is one thing, the next law on our list is something much darker. It wasn't based on a mistake, but on cruelty and greed. And it left a permanent, bloody scar on the soul of America. We now move to the era of Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was a war hero, a man of the people, a tough and decisive president. But he had another side. He was a fervent believer in manifest destiny, the idea that white Americans had a God-given right to expand westward. Standing in their way were the Native American tribes who had lived on those lands for centuries. Specifically, in the Southeast, lived the 5 civilized tribes: the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole. They had adopted many of the white settlers' customs. They created a written language, adopted a constitution modeled on the U.S., became farmers, and even owned slaves. But none of that mattered. Their land was fertile, perfect for growing cotton, and gold had been discovered on Cherokee land. White settlers wanted that land, and Andrew Jackson was determined to give it to them. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act. Officially, the law did not order the forced removal of the tribes. It merely authorized the president to negotiate for their ancestral lands in exchange for territory west of the Mississippi River, barren lands in what is now Oklahoma. Jackson and his supporters cynically framed this as a humane act. They claimed they were saving Native Americans from, quote, by contact with white civilization. It was a monstrous lie. In reality, the act gave a green light to the federal government and state authorities to systematically expel tens of thousands of people from their homes. The Cherokee Nation tried to fight back, using legal means. They took their case to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in the landmark case Worcester versus Georgia, the court sided with them, ruling that Georgia had no right to infringe on their territory. Jackson's legendary response, though not definitively proven, is said to have been, "John Marshall, the Chief Justice, has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." He simply ignored the ruling of the highest court in the land. What followed was a humanitarian catastrophe. At gunpoint, the U.S. Army rounded up thousands of men, women, and children. Their forced march west became known as the Trail of Tears. Of the 16,000 Cherokees who were removed, more than 4,000 died from starvation, disease, and exposure. This wasn't just a dumb law. It was an act of ethnic cleansing, legalized by the President of the United States. This act exposed the dark side of American expansionism and left a legacy of broken treaties and untold suffering. But ironically, as the country expanded west, an even greater conflict was brewing within, the conflict over slavery, which would eventually tear the nation apart. And, as often happens, an attempt to solve the problem with a dumb law only made things worse. The next law was designed to prevent a civil war, but instead, it made one inevitable. This was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, signed by President Millard Fillmore. By the mid-19th century, tensions between the free northern states and the slave-holding southern states had reached a boiling point. Every new territory acquired sparked a fierce debate. Would it be free or slave? In an attempt to prevent the country from breaking apart, a package of 5 laws, known as the _10_ was passed, and its most venomous part was the new draconian Fugitive Slave Act. This law required all citizens, even in free states, to actively assist in the capture and return of escaped slaves. Refusing to help could result in a massive fine and even prison time. The law created special federal commissioners to decide the fate of alleged fugitives. These commissioners were paid $10 for every person they sent back into slavery, and only $5 for every person they set free. It was a system that financially incentivized kidnapping. This law wasn't just unjust, it was monstrous. It turned the northern states into hunting grounds for slave catchers. It meant that even free African Americans born in the North were not safe. They could be seized on a false claim and sent into slavery in the South without a real trial. It forced ordinary Northerners who hated slavery to either become complicit in the system or break the law. The consequences were explosive. Instead of pacifying the South, the law enraged the North. It brought the brutal, inhuman reality of slavery directly to their doorstep. Riots broke out in cities as crowds tried to rescue captured fugitives from federal marshals. Moderate abolitionists became radicals. This law, meant to preserve the Union, actually convinced millions that peaceful coexistence with the slave system was impossible. It added fuel to the fire that would erupt into the Civil War just 10 years later. But if laws based on racism and greed seem like obvious evils, what about a law born from the noblest of intentions, a desire to make America healthier, safer, and more moral? We're talking about the greatest social experiment in U.S. history, which turned into one of its greatest failures. We are talking about Prohibition. By the early 20th century, the temperance movement had gained immense power. Activists, mostly women from religious communities, argued that alcohol was the root of all evil: poverty, crime, domestic violence. Their campaign was incredibly successful. During World War I, they added a patriotic argument. Many breweries were owned by German Americans, and banning alcohol was framed as a strike against the enemy. In 1919, the country did the unthinkable. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. To enforce it, the Volstead Act was passed. President Woodrow Wilson actually vetoed the act, believing it was too extreme, but Congress overrode his veto. The era of Prohibition had begun. America was officially a, quote, 11, quote, country. But, as it turns out, you can't just ban something that millions of people want. Instead of creating a utopia, Prohibition created chaos and birthed the monster America is still fighting today. That monster is organized crime. The demand for alcohol didn't disappear, it just went underground. And that underground market became a goldmine for gangsters. Men like Al Capone in Chicago went from being petty thugs to multimillionaires, running vast empires of smuggling, manufacturing, and selling illegal liquor. They made millions of dollars, which they used to bribe police, judges, and politicians. The streets of cities became battlegrounds where rival gangs fought bloody wars. The law meant to reduce crime led to its unprecedented growth and organization. And what about ordinary Americans? They didn't stop drinking, they just started doing it in secret. Thousands of illegal bars, speakeasies, opened across the country. People began making moonshine at home, often with terrifying results. So-called bathtub gin could contain industrial alcohol, causing blindness, paralysis, and death. Tens of thousands of people died from drinking tainted liquor. Most importantly, Prohibition created a culture of widespread disrespect for the law itself. Millions of otherwise law-abiding citizens became criminals. It was a disaster on all fronts. The government not only failed to enforce the law, but also lost enormous revenue from alcohol taxes, money that was desperately needed during the coming Great Depression. In 1933, after 13 years of chaos, America admitted defeat. The 21st Amendment repealed the 18th. The great experiment in sobriety was over. It was perhaps the most spectacular example of how a law with good intentions can have utterly devastating and unforeseen consequences. Banning a drink was foolish. But what about imprisoning your own citizens based on their ancestry? Our final example is one of the darkest moments in modern American history, and it happened under one of the most revered presidents, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The nation was in shock, fear, and a state of fury. On the West Coast, where a large population of Japanese Americans lived, that fear quickly spiraled into mass hysteria and racist paranoia. Military leaders, politicians, and newspapers began claiming that the Japanese community was a threat to national security, that spies and saboteurs were hiding in their midst. There was no evidence. Not a single Japanese American was ever convicted of espionage for Japan during the war. But facts didn't matter. The pressure on President Roosevelt was immense. On February 19, 1942, just over 2 months after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. The order didn't explicitly mention Japanese people. It gave the military the authority to designate military areas and to exclude any or all persons from them. But everyone knew exactly who it was aimed at. What happened next was one of the greatest violations of civil rights in U.S. history. Over 120,000 people of Japanese descent, 2/3 of whom were American citizens born in the United States, were forcibly removed from their homes. They were given only days to sell or dispose of their property, their homes, farms, and businesses. Then they were put on trains and sent to 10 concentration camps located in desolate, isolated parts of the country. They lived behind barbed wire, under the watch of armed guards, in harsh conditions for several years. They lost everything: their property, their freedom, their dignity. And all of this was done without any due process, without any charges being filed, based solely on their race. The Supreme Court, which should have protected their rights, shamefully upheld the government's actions, calling it a, quote, 16 Executive Order 9066 wasn't just a dumb law, it was a betrayal of American ideals. It showed how easily fear and prejudice can cause a nation to abandon its most fundamental principles. It would take decades for the U.S. government to formally apologize and pay reparations to the survivors. From crushing free speech to destroying the economy, from ethnic cleansing to creating the mafia and imprisoning innocent citizens, history is filled with examples of how presidential power can be used to make catastrophically stupid decisions. These laws serve as a permanent reminder. They show how good intentions can pave the road to hell, how fear can eclipse reason, and how the most powerful job in the world offers no immunity from making colossal mistakes. But these are just the laws we know about. How many more secret orders and directives remain hidden in the archives? Well, that's a story for another time.